There's a crisis in the conservation movement right now, and I believe that climbers and mountain bikers can help save it. I believe that human-powered recreation, thank you. I believe that human-powered recreation can help secure the future of the conservation movement. Now, I'm a climber, so climbers are obviously going to be the heroes of this story. But before I tell you how climbers are going to save the world, I want to tell you a little bit about how climbers view themselves, because we have some unlikely heroes in our community. In the early days, from the 1950s through the early 80s, we were truly on the fringe. Out in the East Coast in the gunks in the 1960s, the so-called vulgarians rejected all forms of regulation, climbing in the nude and infamously peeing on their enemies in an incident which came to define an era. On the West Coast, there were climbers eking out a living in Yosemite National Park, literally living in caves and in their vehicles. In 1977, an airplane full of marijuana crashed in the high Sierra. Climbers raided the site and made a small fortune and created the legend of the crash bud. Now, when I was starting out as a climber, these stories and these people helped shape what it meant for me to be a climber. I once reached into a trash can in a national park and pulled out a piece of pizza and ate it in front of a horrified tourist. Not because I was too poor to buy my own food, but because that was just what climbers did. It's a true story. And the dirtbag ideal still persists to this day. Now, Alex Honnold, who's the greatest free soloist of our time and was recently featured on 60 Minutes and on the cover of National Geographic, was shown living out of the back of his van, eating tuna out of a can with a stick. But our sport has also come a long way. Last year alone, 4.1 million people went sport climbing or bouldering in this country. Now, the early days of mountain biking were on the fringe as well. What started in California in the late 70s and early 80s as a handful of people on clunker bikes pieced together from junk heaps became a legitimate sport, earning inclusion in the Atlanta Olympics in 1996. Now, the ultimate rise to something we might call close to normal of these sports can make it hard to remember that the early pioneers were seen as crazed lunatics by most people. These were adrenaline junkies with poor self-preservation instincts and even worse, prospects for the future. These were not the sorts of people that you wanted your children to be hanging out with. These were not the sorts of people who you would ever expect to be future leaders of business or a conservation movement. However, some of them built deep connections with nature as a product of these experiences and later turned their eyes towards conservation. Some of you may recognize this. Perhaps the most famous climber conservationist of our time was Yvon Chouinard, a self-taught blacksmith and climber who revolutionized the sport by manufacturing better climbing equipment and espousing a clean climbing ethic. He went on to found Patagonia Clothing Company and became an outspoken advocate for responsible business practices and conservation. Now, his lesser-known climbing partner, Doug Tompkins, gave the country of Chile a scare in the early 90s when he bought a tract of old-growth forest so large it bisected the country. This created Parque Pumalín. In so doing, he preserved hundreds of thousands of acres of old-growth forest, including this stand of 1,000-year-old alerce trees. But a lot has changed in the last few decades, and support for conservation may be waning. Now, there's a lot of things that we can be concerned about these days. Global warming, overfishing, fracking. Okay, maybe not fracking, it's complicated, but I don't know. But the crisis I want to talk about is the crisis of demographics. The Nature Conservancy is the world's largest environmental organization. It claims 1 million members and has preserved 119 million acres of land and 5,000 miles of rivers. These are impressive numbers, but there's one trend that's troubling. The median age of their membership is 62, and only 8.5% of their members are under the age of 45. Now, this lack of engagement with the younger generation, as well as lack of engagement with people from diverse racial and socioeconomic backgrounds, is a serious problem for all the big conservation organizations in our country, including the Sierra Club and the Wilderness Society. Now, we owe these organizations in this movement a huge debt of gratitude. Our rivers aren't catching on fire anymore like they used to. For the most part, we've got cleaner water and cleaner air, and we have the Wilderness Act to protect our pristine lands. But without a broad base of support for conservation in the upcoming generations, where will future political and financial support for conservation come from? So the Nature Conservancy has recently revamped its mission and messaging, and you will now see that people are included in its materials, that conservation is lauded for the benefits it provides to individuals and humanity in general. Because people need to know that conservation is in their own self-interest, or the movement will surely fail. In 2009, they commissioned a study to see what the connection with outdoor experiences and future support of conservation was, and there was a very direct connection. The report found that one of the greatest threats to the conservation movement may be waning public support due to decreased participation in outdoor recreation. Now, traditionally, part of the conservation movement has been about keeping people out, carving out tracts of land from development, from certain types of human activities, or maybe even human contact of any kind. But it also has to be about getting people out, getting people outside to see and bear witness to what is at stake. Now, all this tells me that the human-powered outdoor recreation movement has a big role to play in the future of conservation, and in fact, we're already doing quite a bit on our own. I'm the executive director of the Access Fund, the national advocacy organization that keeps climbing areas open and conserves the climbing environment. I'm also current chairman of the Outdoor Alliance. Now, in the last few years, the advocacy organizations for mountain bikers, climbers, backcountry skiers, hikers, and paddlers, we've all gotten together and formed this alliance, and we're working together on shared policy and conservation goals in Washington, D.C. Now, one of the best things about being a part of this alliance is that when we're talking about conservation, we can bring so many different issues into the conversation. For example, jobs and the economy. According to a report released by the Outdoor Industry Association earlier this year, the outdoor recreation economy in this country is responsible for hundreds of billions of dollars in consumer spending every year. And if you carve out cycling, human-powered trail sports, and climbing, that accounts for about $160 billion. Now, the important takeaway here is that this is too large of a constituency to ignore. And this industry can be a powerful force for changing the way that we as a nation value our public lands, away from something that's based almost entirely upon extraction of resources to something that's based more on experience. With no land to recreate on, that means fewer jobs and less economic activity. And as you can imagine, in this political climate, the best way to get people's attention in Washington, D.C. is to talk about jobs. Now, when I go to D.C. to educate our nation's leaders on the issues important to our community, I can talk to the most conservative Republican and the most liberal Democrat. Jobs, the economy, public access to public land, property values, as well as conservation values, public health, quality of living. These are all issues and themes that resonate with nearly everyone. And our movement is making some progress. We're influencing public policy. We're getting parks and paths built. We're buying land. We're getting dams removed. And we're even securing remediation for multinational corporations. And the reason that I personally have dedicated myself to this is because of this. This is how I spent my teens and 20s. This is the guy who took the pizza out of the trash can. Now, it would seem that this is a match made in heaven, recreation and conservation. And indeed, here in Boulder, I'm sure we're all well aware that there is an amazing amount of open space that's been set aside for both people and nature, and recreation figures in. But sometimes the old schisms still drive us apart. A 20-year-old ban on mountain biking was recently upheld in an area known as the Western Trail Study Area, which is basically the land surrounding the famous Flatirons outside of Boulder, Colorado. Now, the mountain bikers wanted a connector trail to get to the great riding south of town so they didn't have to drive there, so they could ride their bikes there. And there are many elements of the conservation community who were vehemently opposed to their proposal. They cited what had happened 20 years ago when mountain bikes had been allowed, environmental concerns, and user conflicts. And there was one organization whose mission is to protect and interconnect half of the planet's land and water for nature that weighed in against this proposal. Now, why is that? Did a mountain bike trail threaten their mission? Is it that we haven't learned how to build sustainable trails or manage user conflicts over the last 20 years? No. I think it was personal and ideological. Some people just didn't want bikes there, period. Now, to be clear, the bikers, mountain bikers, share some of the blame here, and I'm not standing in front of you here to point fingers. What I want to say is, I found this whole situation to be incredibly sad because people who should have been allies became sworn enemies. I think a compromise could have been reached, a compromise that ultimately would have done a better job of protecting the land in the long run, in that it would have built a bigger constituency for the support of open lands in Boulder, rather than alienating an important and growing group of people. And this is not just happening in Boulder, Colorado. In many ways, we're a microcosm of what's happening in the nation and around the world. Earlier this year, I was at a conference in Brazil and was astounded to see them struggling with these very same issues. So, conservation community, are you listening? We are your allies. You need us, and we need you. And we, all of us, need to do a better job working together. If you want to build a durable base of support for conservation, you need young people who are passionate and engaged with the outdoors. And they may gain those passions in ways you don't like or approve of. But I ask some of you to be a little bit more flexible and practical. Let's take science and the political realities of our day as our guides for how to build sustaining support for the protection of land and nature. And to the outdoor recreation community, let's keep some of those great qualities of our dirtbag roots, but we've got to move forward. Our activities are legitimate uses of the land, but we can't go everywhere and we can't do whatever we want, and we don't have a God-given or constitutional right to do so. That's a newsflash for some people. I think that we need to show the conservation movement our gratitude and our respect, and recognize that we're an important part of that movement, and to recognize our power and our responsibility. And that means being good partners with like-minded individuals and organizations. That means being excellent stewards of the land ourselves, and that means imbuing these ethics in the upcoming generations. Climbing has been called, or I should say climbers have been called conquistadors of the useless, because we're obsessed with this dangerous, egotistical, and ultimately meaningless pursuit. Some people say that. But I believe that climbing has meaning, and I think climbers have always known that. Because if you go outside and climb or partake in adventure recreation, you're building deep connections with the land. It's becoming a part of you in spite of yourself. And if you then act upon that, if you step forward with your fellow adventurers to protect these places and this planet and all its natural beauty, then you've found something deeply meaningful in an activity which might have at first seemed frivolous or even at odds with the natural world. So please, go out and experience nature and the outdoors. Experience it as intensely as you can. Thank you.